Welcome to the Intellectual Anarchy podcast. I'm Patrick Sullivan.
And I'm Catherine Cruz, and I'm just a curious cat. Just remember thinking like, okay, the first time I took a philosophy class and learning about the paradigm shift, and it's just like, oh, okay, just another way of seeing the world.
Exactly. And so what's interesting is that the basis of this is philosophical, right? The audacity of thinking of a different world, of a different idea, of solving a problem with a different approach. You have to be comfortable with that coloring outside the lines, going off road and trying things or talking to people that are different. But it is deeply a philosophic question that you would recognize the world could be different than what you think it is. And the things that drive it in the technology space, I refer to as methods and materials, right? The things that were available at one time in history, like when the Wright brothers did their aircraft. Well, you couldn't buy a lot of stuff, so they used fabric and bicycle gear. But today you've got carbon fiber. That didn't exist back then. So of course they didn't use that, but if you said you can only make airplanes out of fabric and bicycle parts, that doesn't make any sense. And so the methods and materials have changed, and so what was not doable becomes doable, and what's unthinkable becomes possible. And so that's the really interesting thing about it, as you create these categories of things based on these kind of shifts in paradigm that, you thought the world was one way, then you discover it's different. And based on that, what do? Right?
Well, I think of like the Native Hawaiians, right? Surfing. They use boards. And the materials have changed, and you've got now a faster board and, that kind of thing. You've got stand-up paddles, you've got kite surfing, and it's really interesting to see how that's just evolved as opposed to just, a board on a wave.
Absolutely. And you've got these boards now, we see them on the windward side when the wind is down. So they're planing with a single strut that goes through the surface, but they got a little motor on the back. And so it's like a motorized skateboard, except it's a surfboard, but the motor is underwater and the thing planes and comes above water. It's very cool. You see them kind of rolling, racing back and forth. But those parts didn't exist even 10 years ago, right? But now you can get these little motors and very compact batteries and lots of energy density in the batteries, and they're available, now to anybody. But that's an innovation. But see, back when Duke was building his boards out of redwood or other types of wood that would work well in the ocean, you didn't have these other materials. You didn't have electric motors. You didn't have this kind of fabric for kiting and all those things. So absolutely. My guess is that, he was a real innovator. He would probably have innovated into these spaces as well, because the huge possibilities. Now, the thing is, when you try something, trying to figure out if you like it or not, right? If it's the right thing for you. So there's all kinds of sails for kiting. You got the bat wing. You got all these different versions, but it's because of technology that people use it in these ways that were unimaginable.
I just remember thinking at one time we had a lot of young creative minds who were in Silicon Valley, and a lot of those folks that made a lot of money were coming over to Maui, and they were, jumping on the latest kite surfing thing or whatever. I mean, they were just out there pushing the envelope in a different way.
Oh, yeah. No, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, clearly on Maui, but I'm thinking of Nash on the windward side with kite surfing.
Yes.
Robbie Nash. So I used to live over there. His family had a shop there for many years. But back then, that was a kind of a crazy idea.
Right. Windsurfing. Like what?
Right. And it just continues. Now, what's really interesting, you mentioned these folks from Silicon Valley, is I see some of these guys coming over, and it's good that they're interested, but their level of skill and their comfortability in the ocean is challenged. And so some of them I talked to some of them, I'm thinking, you need to kind of take it easy here before you kill yourself, because they're pushing to go into big surf. They're pushing. It's kind of like a few years back, I was out at Sunset in the lineup. There were 300 people. And so I counted. It was insane. I thought it was big surf, but I thought this is a recipe for a huge disaster, because all these guys are really aggressive. Now, a lot of them don't know what they're getting into, but then I was at a hardware store actually several years ago, and there was these guys who had just come from the mainland, and they wanted to do tow-in, and they're trying to get bigger ropes and all kinds of things. They'd never done it, and I was saying, man,
take it slow
it down here because, it's an extreme sport, and you've got to be well prepared. So a lot of local guys know this, right? And you kind of train and you try to pace yourself so that you can be in the right spot with training at the right time. Plus, you have people looking after safety. So if you're going to do something, you might want to let somebody know or have your buddy go out with you. Yeah, some of these guys I don't know, so I worry about them.
Well, okay, so when you go from surfing to windsurfing, the balance is a little different.
Yeah.
Same thing if you're surfing versus snowboarding, right? You just got to find that sweet spot. But it's a little different on a windsurfer. Kind of got to lean back.
And best learned in places like Waikiki. It's very forgiving. That's where we took the kids to learn because, it's relatively safe no matter what happens. But if you're going to Jaws on Maui, or if you're going to log cabins, or if you're going, it's like, okay, you got to really get your head together and make sure you're ready. Those are pretty serious spots. So there's really good places here to practice and learn stuff. And the windward side, again, is really good for kite surfing, windsurfing, because the wind blows on shore. So even if you totally lose it and just hang out for a while, it'll tend to blow you toward the beach as opposed to out to sea.
Okay, so as you look at these different analogies, given what you're trying to do with Oceanit,
well, this issue of the risk of the expert, right? Somebody that only sees the world one way doesn't create a good environment for innovating or adopting. So the thing about surfing is you have a lot of people that are willing to take a chance, try things, new things. So that's the good thing. So you have a culture there that's more inclined to try things. My only comment is, try not to lose your life doing it, but go for it. But what we learned here at Oceanit is there's this risk of the subject matter expert. So that's what's called an SME. And so that's somebody who's well regarded in a particular field, who has spent a good part of their career in that one field. And they have a lot to offer, but sometimes they get stuck in not realizing that methods and materials have changed. And so the world evolved, but they don't see it that way. So we find one of the curses we have here is we run into those people, because if we're doing disruptive innovation, you're going to find those people when you get into the market. So if you're dealing in the energy space, industrial applications, even medical applications, a whole bunch of things, there's a lot of skepticism. On the one hand, you can see that not everything is possible today. So if we can levitate I think we can, but we can't. That's not a good thing. But if we have an idea to do something different and we have sound science, what we do here in order to deal with the SME, the subject matter expert, is we actually build something and then we test it. So we get real data. When we have real data and you put that in front of people, it's transformative. But you've got to really build it. Even if it's a what we call a toy science. Like, watch, I'm going to do this thing and I'm going to do it again and again. Okay, so that's what we're talking about. Then you get into this question of scale up. But you're dealing with trying to convince somebody that the science is there. They just didn't consider it that way.
So it might be clunky initially, crude,
very
and
much
then
so.
you refine it.
Absolutely. But the toy science is really about the proof of the idea. Like, this really works. Watch this. Okay, now watch it again. So we'll do that. And we find for a lot of things we do here that actually is, it's interesting because we're in Hawaii, but we literally build things. And then we go jump on an airplane and sit with somebody and let them try it. But when we do that, that convinces them. They become real advocates.
Say, see, it works.
So we produce data. The more disruptive something is, the more important it is to have real data. Because you're going to find people that say, well, look, I've been doing this for a long time. It's not possible.
Okay, so I know Duke didn't just surf. He also swam. But he also, I think, played around with his kick when he would swim.
Right.
And I'm a swimmer, and I've come to love the monofin, which is a totally different way of moving your body. It's a different way of moving your body. You're still going through the water. And with a monofin, it's faster than traditional swimming. And so, yeah, you can just say, yeah, this is how we've been swimming all these years, but try it this way, or change your kick, or do something.
Yeah, I'm not having met Duke myself, but I'm guessing what he was doing was, when you're surfing and you're trying to get on the wave, you give that last second kick. You do whatever you do to kind of get that speed to get on the wave. And I think that's what he did.
Yeah, you just break through.
And he brought that into swimming. So he brought surfing into swimming. So he adapted the way he would surf to the way he swam. But it wasn't what everybody else was doing. Now, he was built, if you look at his physique, he was built like a swimmer, I think. But things like those kicks, it's kind of like you're giving it that last oomph to get on the wave, and so you're trying to accelerate. Mm-hmm. There's things like that you do. Surfing, you may not do that swimming necessarily, but you definitely do it if you're surfing. So my guess is that's what he did with certain, parts of especially in a pool, right? But if you're trying to catch a wave, of course it makes sense because whether you're on a canoe or a board or anything else, the wave's coming in, you're saying, okay, now everybody go,
Mm-hmm.
go. Yeah, that's what I think happened.
When you assemble your teams of people from these different disciplines, you've got the SMEs, the subject matter experts.
Well, what we generally do to begin with is the teams are much more disparate. We don't, in the beginning, usually have a subject matter expert sitting there. We have very, very smart people with PhDs in all kinds of subjects, but maybe not that particular thing. And that actually turns out to be a benefit because they're not coming in with, here's how it's always been done. Now, at some point, we need to know here's how it's always been done. But if we just look at it in its more, pure sense, the unvarnished problem that we're trying to think about, and we give people the opportunity and the space to think, they bring ideas into that. And
so it's not just, I know this area and it can't be done. It's what's possible.
Right. And the way that team tends to work, it's a little unusual, but this is really how it works. It's kind of like improv, or it's kind of like the metaphor that's been used is how people play jazz. You get a bunch of people that are really good at something, but they play together and they riff off each other and they build ideas that way. So we do that when it comes to creating innovation. Now, the SME is usually the gatekeeper to industry adoption. And by that, I mean, if I have a way to make, power plants more energy efficient, you've got a guy that's been doing it for most of his life, and he doesn't know you, and he hasn't changed anything in 3 decades. And so you're going to have to get by him. Now, usually what happens is the senior management will say, well, you should look at this. And usually they'll say, I looked at it, and they'll dismiss it. But occasionally we'll find somebody that'll take a chance. And usually there are organizations that are in a bit of a pinch and they need to try something new. One of the things I mentioned in the book, but it's an interesting story. For anybody that's been to Telluride, Colorado, so it's in a canyon and there's a waterfall. So Telluride was a mining town and they needed to mechanize some of the mining. Now, you had Nikola Tesla, not the car, but the innovator, who had this idea about induction, who was competing with Edison. Edison was saying, here's how you're going to do electricity, and Tesla's saying, but I think it's this way. So that mine took a chance on him to build the first, and with the support, I think, of Westinghouse, the first induction motor in a waterfall. Bridledale Falls became, I think, the first hydroelectric plant in the country. But see, the mine took a chance because they were in a bit of a pinch and they needed to do something. So what we end up doing with really disruptive technology in order to get past the subject matter expert is to find an opportunity where they need to try something or they're going to be toast. So what is it we can do? And if we find those people, they would be early adopters. But they're early adopters because they needed to try something. Now, we may work with their team, their subject matter expert, the folks that they have on board. But if you go to somebody where everything is just running smooth, the subject matter expert will just basically stop you at the door. And there's nobody that wants to take a chance on anything. So when we're finding early adopters for disruptive technology, we're looking for people that are in a situation where they want to try something. Because we'll work with the SMEs, but the SMEs are under a lot of pressure because they know for them to keep their job, they're going to have to figure out how to solve a problem. And if they don't have an answer, they've got to open their mind a little bit. So in that case, it's better to keep things moving than to be right and have things fail. And so they're willing to take a chance. So we end up working with people and organizations that are in a bit of a pickle. They like to work with us. And so that includes people in government, people in all kinds of businesses, but people that are really driven to do something that maybe is out of the ordinary. Whereas the companies that everything is just fine, they're not interested in change, and they're certainly not interested in disruptive change.
Right, because they're in their comfort zone and
exactly.
They'll just plod along.
But that's where the role of the subject matter expert is really important, because back in the day, I think you had J.P. Morgan underwriting Edison on the East Coast. And Tesla was known as a bright but difficult chap, but with really good ideas. Found somebody to take a chance. And in some ways, that's kind of what we end up doing, more like that. Because we don't have the institutional support from in the case of Edison with the banks, and they were doing DC electricity, but there were a lot of limitations on how that would work. It turns out what we do today is AC because of the stuff that Tesla had thought about. And that first demo was really there in Telluride. So when you go to Telluride, the waterfall is still there, the power plant is still there, and you can find some of these really cool pictures of the gear they made, kind of original articles of these big windings, copper things, they're like these machines they built, because you can't go and buy it. You got to build it. So they built those things. And so when you go to some of the, there's an old part of the town, well, it's a cool town, but there's some bars and hotels and things. They've got on the walls some of these really cool pictures that go back to that time in history, because it was a mining town. It wasn't a ski town back then.
Right.
I don't think people knew about skiing.
Yeah, but I guess when you think about that, even with skiing, right? From skiing to snowboarding and just different ways
Absolutely.
of being on the snow, being on the water, and just to try it. Go for it, right? Cowabunga, just try it.
Yeah. Well, you definitely see that in skiing. There's been so much technology from the first pair of skis I had. The bindings and the whole thing was like something you'd see in a museum piece. Whereas today, it's totally different. But the skis and boots, bindings, everything have changed. And it gives you all kinds of flexibility in how to do new things that were not doable. Right? So when you look at the, like in skiing, what brought in the advent of moguls, right? That required a different kind of ski than just giant slalom and downhill. And now, of course, moguls is part of the Olympics, and it's a crazy thing to watch. It's a lot of fun. But it was a change in technology. It was a change in the way people thought of doing things and the way to recreate, lots of experimentation. And then I think people were just having too much fun. And then I think that's what led to hey, maybe this should be an Olympic sport.
Right. So basically then your approach is, you get smart people in the room, folks that are willing to take a chance and maybe try looking at things a little bit differently.
Right. You get them in the room so that it kind of requires, we talk about it here, parking their egos at the door so that they can hear what other people are saying. So you have other ideas. You can debate those ideas, but you end up in a debate. And then what we do here is we try to pick something. It's like, okay, let's settle it. So let's set up an experiment and see what happens. Fire the puppy up and let's see, does it go this way or that way? But what it does is it creates a debate. And when you do an experiment like that, you either find, wow, it really did work, or it didn't, but here's what we learned. And that's how you keep doing it. But the process, I was just telling somebody the other day, it's kind of like improv because it's not scripted. It's this open conversation of building on other ideas, right? So if you look at, one of the things we thought of doing to train some of the new folks, we're always looking at how to train people better. But you take, really well-educated, PhD science folks and engineers, and we're going to get so improv is used for comedy. So to get them to look at training the scientists on the rules of improv. Improv is really structured with rules, but at the same time, it seems totally random. But that's how it works. It's very similar to that, except it's around science, engineering, and technology. But what that does, that helps us create these ideas, but then we always end up with, okay, how do we deal with a subject matter expert as we're moving it from the lab, like, wow, we got this thing working, to, okay, we're going to explain to them something that maybe they thought was never thought or thinkable or doable or possible. And when we find those situations and those people, we'll do, those early demonstrations, those pilots, to kind of work out some of the operating pieces. And then you start building momentum.
Yeah, but you got to have that breakthrough.
Right. But the risk of expert thinking, as I talk about in the book, is really, it's needed for a lot of things. So if you're going to get your teeth drilled, you'd like to have a dentist that has drilled before. You don't want them doing improv in your mouth. It's not going to be good. Be fun. So there's a place for those folks. But then if you're saying, how do I come up with a technology that I'm not able to, to put a thing in your mouth or whatever it might be, you have to step way back and say, I don't know, how would we ever do that? So there's a time and a place for it. But there's clearly a requirement and a need for experts. But everybody needs to recognize from a situational standpoint, if you're really trying to push beyond that because of a really hard problem, that's usually how it happens, then you need people that are going to open their minds to ideas.
Yeah, just step back and let a child in the room and let them pick it up and look at it in a different way.
And that childlike perspective is really important. And I think for a lot of adults, it gets kind of beat out of them. So when they grow up, they don't have it anymore. But if you can find that childlike excitement or amazement or delight in these things and start building on that, then you can start looking at the world a little differently. Because I think it's going on around us all the time. I think we're all so busy, we kind of zone it out. So sometimes it's hard to just stop, try to be quiet and maybe observe or see things, to see the world differently.
Okay, so the next time I have a hard problem, it's child play.
You know, kids are amazing. The kinds of imagination they have and the curiosity. They're interested in everything, like why it works and how it works, and they want to test it, and they want to test everybody, the parents and everybody around them. There's a little video clip of my nephew who's just turned 1 year old. I'm not sure exactly how this happened, but I saw it on my phone. They had a birthday candle in a cupcake. And I think it's his first time, and he's looking at the candle burning, and he reaches over and he grabs it, and he lets out a scream. But I thought, okay, that's cool. He's very curious. He'll, of course, remember what a candle is.
Right, hot.
But, if you've never seen one before, what would you do? You might do the same thing. And that's really a pretty awesome thing to see, because clearly you don't want people injured, and he's fine. But we take a lot for granted because we've been around it for a long time. But yeah, fresh eyes, right? A lot of children see the world with fresh eyes, and they can see things that could be different. And that's the thing adults need to try to work on, is trying to find how to see the world with fresh eyes.
Okay. So yeah. So that's Oceanit's point of view.
Yes. And, but it's interesting because it's part of the culture, mm-hmm. right? It's the culture we have here. And I think what makes it maybe natural for us is, at the core, we're Hawaiian. I mean, not necessarily ethnic Hawaiian, but culturally Hawaiian. And by that, I mean, we're a mix of all kinds of people. So people bring different backgrounds and perspectives and life experiences, cultural practices to what they do here. And so innovation comes from differences, not sameness, right? So when you've got a culturally diverse community, it's the perfect place to innovate. Contrary to what some people think of Hawaii sometimes, because we're dominated by a visitor industry. That's a fantastic industry, but innovation comes from difference. And so if you look at different communities and parts of the world, if it's a monoculture of just everybody's the same, their level of innovation is relatively weak.
Flat.
Yeah, it's flat. But if it's diverse and you get all kinds of people, you get a lot more coming out of that group. That's what we have here. But it's also a reflection of Hawaii, and that kind of informs the culture of the business, Oceanit. So they're connected.